So, thank you, Christina. Really, really great seeing you all. Welcome. I am Ashley Adams, and I'm the Arts Integration Strategist here at Van Cortlandt Park Alliance. I really, really appreciate you being here for this exciting and educational experience regarding Pinkster. I'm going to leave an explanation of what Pinkster is and its ongoing legacy to our historical experts who I'll introduce in a bit. This presentation is going to operate as a Q&A where I'm going to be asking our experts some questions and letting them go on and giving us all the information. And at the end of the presentation, we'll take about 10 minutes to take questions from the audience. And feel free to utilize the chat if you have comments or if you have questions, and we'll review them toward the end. I really hope that you guys will join us for our annual Pinkster Festival on Saturday, May 4th from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. It is free, and it's a really great celebration where we're going to have lots of theater, tour, arts and crafts, food. So we really hope to see you there. So without further ado, I will introduce our first expert, Lavada Nahon. Lavada is the interpreter of African American history for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Bureau of Historic Sites. She is also a culinary historian focused on the 17th to 19th century Mid-Atlantic region, with an emphasis on the work of enslaved cooks in the homes of the elite class. She has 18 plus years of public history experience working with a variety of historic sites, societies, and museums across the tri-state region. Lavada has developed educational programs, after-school programs, lectures and tours, period presentations, and historic dinners for sites ranging from the New York Historical Society, Albany Institute of Art and History, Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, Johnson Hall, and many, many more. She's worked as a museum associate and educator for Historic Hudson Valley for 12 years, and at Van Cortlandt Manor and Phillipsburg Manor, Upper Mills, as a production coordinator for their special events team for 3 years. Her mission is to bring history to life by giving presence to the Africans and people of African descent, enslaved and free, in the landmass that was once New Netherland, New York, in whatever way possible. Lavada, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I'm really, really excited to talk to you. I know we're really excited to hear about your expertise. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And next, I'd like to introduce you to Chief Bob Neal Clarke. Neal Clarke is internationally acclaimed as a percussionist involved with traditional African drumming and the percussive arts for more than half a century. In addition to his activities as a professional performer, Chief Baba Neal, as he is now affectionately called, has been active in arts education programming for more than 4 decades as an educator and a consultant. He has conducted artist residencies and designed programming at all educational levels from elementary and middle school to secondary and college. And he has served as a presenter and a consultant for many of the major cultural institutions in the New York area, including the Caribbean Cultural Festival, the Museum of Natural History, and the Brooklyn Children's Museum, to name a few. He will also be performing at our Pinkster Day Festival on May 4th from 12 to 4. So if you want to hear that amazing percussion, you can come to that event. Chief Baba Neal, really, really looking forward to hearing from you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Ashley.
Of
It's my
course.
pleasure.
So I will throw our first question out to our experts, and that is, what is Pinkster and what are its origins?
Pinkster is a short version of the Dutch word Pinkersten for Pentecost. It is just straight Dutch for the Christian celebration of Pentecost. And Pentecost is the second major feast of the Christian church. In today's world, we have skewed that calendar, but the calendar is actually Easter as a major feast, and that's the Christ risen. And then we have Pinkster, which is the last day he walks the earth. And when he is leaving, he's back up in the upper room with the disciples. He throws up, he gifts them as he is leaving the Holy Spirit. And they then receive the Spirit. They throw open the doors of the room. They start preaching to the people that are in Jerusalem for the Feast of the First Fruits. And each person hears them in their own language. So it is actually the beginning of the Christian church. So this is the point where then the apostles go off and start, that first generation of people called Christians. So a lot of people don't realize that the enslaved, most of the enslaved that came into New York, particularly during the New Netherland period, came out of Congo and Angola. Many of them were already Christian. The first king
Alfonso,
went to,
Alfonso,
I'm sorry?
Alfonso.
Alfonso, actually Alfonso's the son.
Yeah.
His name is, I want to say Juan, but I know that's not correct. He converts
João.
to Christianity in 1498. His son, Alfonso, actually makes Christianity the state religion. So, and we have wonderful letters. There was an exhibit not long ago at the Met called Congo, Majesty and Power, where letters from the King of Congo to the King of Portugal were actually on display. So by the time we get to the slave trade, many of the Congolese and Angolans who come into New York are already Christian. So they're celebrating that day. And then, so the other thing that happens with Pinkster, there's two calendars that kind of really run the event. There is the religious calendar, and it floats. Pentecost is 50 days after Easter. And then there's the agricultural calendar. Pinkster always falls late May, early June. So that gives an opportunity here in New York. They grew winter wheat. So it's already in the ground, it's already growing, but the earth is still too cold for any of the other plants other than peas. I think peas go in March, but otherwise, this is a time where there's no real work to do. So the enslaved are given over time anywhere from 3 to 5 days off. Not everyone is given that time off because while they are off, their owners are also off celebrating. People go visit family and take that time to travel. But if you are enslaved in a house where you're hosting the family, you may not get that time off. But the enslaved actually traveled. And they gathered all up and down the Hudson River Valley into Long Island, into New Jersey, and sometimes in very large groups, but we also have documentation that sometimes they just gathered in local farms on smaller groups. The largest groups are actually in Albany on Pinkster Hill. And Pinkster Hill is actually where the state capitol sits today. And then they celebrated Pinkster. There is a Congolese Christian rite, an African Christian rite. They were Roman Catholics, and they celebrated in their own way, in their own style, using their instruments, their foods, their gatherings. It is a time when people can rejoin and be together. It is documented in our history, both from a European standpoint but also from an African standpoint. And by the mid-19th century, when Pinkster is being suppressed, it is known predominantly in our area as an African celebration.
And speaking about how the Africans would incorporate their own culture into the celebration, what were those key elements that utilized their culture in the celebration of Pinkster?
Well, in any religious tradition, it is, people sing music in their own languages and they use the instruments that they are familiar with. They gather and serve the foods, and the games they play are those they bring from their culture. And that's what we have documented here. Um, when we look at some of the newspaper accounts, particularly when you look at those surrounding the larger events like in Albany, it's set up almost like an African village where the residents of the area for the king and his court is set aside. And then there's a whole dancing area right in front of them. And it's like a village. The campground is set up in concentric circles. Now, does that happen everywhere? No. But because they were working in an open field here in Albany, that's the way it was. But we know they gathered at many of the markets in New York City, which were in fact these big open brick places. So you have that same kind of setup because people come and they're staying for several days. So they're camping out, right? So you're not going to camp right in front of the party space. You're going to camp on the edges. And then you have the places for the performances and the dancing and the drumming happening in that central square.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Chief Avenel, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the drums that were incorporated into the Pinkster Festival.
Well, as Lavada said, folks would celebrate in their own ways. So they would sing in their languages. They would do their dances and they would play their musical instruments. It's important to recognize that just like anywhere else, people in different areas might do the same thing, but in slightly different ways. So you would have folks that might be from one region or one village in the Congo, and they might have a different dialect than someone in another area. They may play a different type of drum. They may play different rhythms on the same type of drum. So it's documented that during the Pinkster festivals, there would be dance competitions within that area that was carved out on on Pinkster Hill, what we know today is Capitol Hill, where people would come, and because folks could travel, because people were proud of their heritage, and that's an important component of the Pinkster Festival that we must realize is that the narratives that have been advanced as far as the history of the enslaved in America is that they forgot about their heritage. They were stripped of their heritage. They lost their heritage. And a lot of times that was the intention, because for people to have an identity that they were rooted in and they were proud of, then that gives people the ability to resist the intentions of others to make them less than human, to make them, anonymous, to make them so. At a time like Pinkster, it is very important to recognize that enslaved Africans who were here in the Hudson River Valley were celebrating their pre-enslavement culture and heritage. They maintained it and they exercised it every opportunity they got. Now, most of the time they might not have done it overtly, because it would bring down repercussions from their slave owners. It would cause problems for them. But at a time like Pinkster, they would engage in these practices. And because of the cultural differences, a lot of times people who were not from their area or people who were not enslaved, the slave holders, they would not necessarily recognize what it was that people were doing. The music that was played on the drums was not recognized as music. And we could go into all kinds of reasons why an ear that is tuned to the Western scale is not going to appreciate music that is played on what they might term crude instruments, because the intervals between the notes on those scales is smaller. So it really requires one to have a more acute listening in order to appreciate the music that's being played on those instruments. And they would have competitions. They would dance. People would sing in their languages. And I like to say a lot of times that if people don't know Africa, they don't realize it, they don't recognize it when it shows up. So there are elements of Congolese culture that come from traditional celebrations that might be mimicking competition, or they might be mimicking combat, where and these are celebrations that would take place at the installation of kings in the Congo. So these are traditions, again, that people brought forward and they maintained it. And Pinkster was the one time of the year when they could publicly engage in these exercises over a period of time. It was not momentary, because in some of the bigger festivals, say in Albany and in New York City, some of the other places, they would have several days that they could engage in these activities. So they would do the drumming, they would do the dancing, they would sing in languages, they were people were allowed to, in some places, trade the surplus goods from their gardens. They could trade in materials that they fabricated, clothing or baskets or any number of things. So it was a time in the Hudson River Valley where Africans really had an opportunity to exercise who they were in a way that they may not have been able to the rest of the year.
And it's important to remember, like, spring is not the only time the enslaved have off. But the other time they have off is January for New Year's Day. So they can't travel. You know, we are warming in our lifetimes, we are feeling the earth warming. But the 17th, 18th, early 19th century is really the end of a little ice age. It's cold and things are frozen. When even 20 years ago, when I moved up to the Hudson River Valley, the Hudson would freeze in the winter, so you're not going anywhere. But here it is spring. At best, you have to deal with the rain, but you're not locked in. And the way the enslaved are held here in New York, they are everywhere. They're in the urban spaces, but they're also out on all of the farms. Here in New York, we have, a system. Our plantation system is different from that in the South, where here we have manors and pattens and large farms, but they're not worked as a single unit. The owners of those properties may have a manor house or a big house somewhere, but the rest of that land is broken into small farms, at least to Northern European tenants. The tenant system starts in New York in the 17th century, and it does not end until the 1830s. So each of those tenant farms are also locations of the enslaved. But you have one over here and two over there and another one way over there. So they're very isolated. So to have an opportunity to go into urban spaces or to gather on one of the larger farms where they can have permission to do that, to be in number, is really important. It's really important.
And to Lavada's point, the cold was a time that you would not be playing drums. Anybody that knows anything about playing drums with your hands, when you play drums with your hands, it hurts. When you play drums in the cold with your hands, it really hurts. So people are not really going to do that. The materials that were used to construct the instruments did not necessarily respond well to cold weather. So Pinkster was a time when a lot of those elements, considering the fact that where people were coming from, those traditions were traditions that were exercised in a tropical environment. So the time that they would exercise those outwardly would be in the springtime. But another point that I failed to bring up was the election of the Pinkster king. So that was another component of Congolese culture. There was leadership, there was kingship. As Lavada said, the kingdom of the Congo, the king converted to Christianity, what was it, 1490, 1491, 1498. So that's, that's 200 years or 150 years before the Dutch even arrived in New Netherlands. So, people were exercising, celebrating Christian celebrations in Africa for 150 years before they were taken into enslavement and brought here. And one of the cornerstones was the structure of African society and African civilization and the leadership. So in each community, there was a memory of leadership in Congo culture, in African society. So times like the Pinkster Festival will give opportunity for people to exercise those you know practices of selecting leadership from suitable members of the community and holding them up as examples, even if they were in a condition of enslavement and not seen that way by the greater society. Within the slave society, people were recognized for the qualities that they exhibited of leadership.
This was a great segue into a question I had because the Pinkster King is really of interest, I think, to me throughout Pinkster Day. Who is the Pinkster King? What is their role? And what qualities does one need to have in order to be crowned Pinkster King?
Well, first I have to say, so people are clear, New York is importing directly from Africa until the law says we cannot import from Africa. So over a 200-year period, there are boats coming directly here. Then there are others who are coming not just from Congo and Angola, but then we also have the presence of the Yoruba culture within the archaeological legacy here in New York, right? So there is that whole mixture, and kings are important in all of those cultures. You know, we are so fascinated by European royalty, but royalty has always been a part of African culture. And having that representative, someone to look up to, someone who actually can also speak for the community, or someone that can be used as a counselor for within the community is really important. Not every location did have kings, but we do know that they existed both in New York City, and King Charlie, who is the most famous of them, was in Albany. But there, you know, New York is a large influx of not just enslavers, but New York is also the home of a lot of slave traders. So we have people here from Madagascar, we have people here from the Yoruba land, we have people here from Congo and Angola. And we know this because it is showing up both in document history, but it's also showing up in archaeology, right? So a lot of our Black history, that religious presence and that mixture of both Christianity and traditional African religions is showing up in archaeology. And that is all over from Long Island all the way up into the Mohawk River Valley. So there is that both. We're not saying that all of the enslaved are Christian. We know that there are, as I said, evidence of all of this mixture. But we also know that we are importing directly from Congo and Angola throughout the time of the trade.
And I think it's important to recognize also that Ashley, it's yes, it is the king, but again, how many of us really have an understanding of what the structure of leadership in Africa is? So you have leadership structure where you have kings and you have chiefs and you have leaders of quarters. So when people are enslaved and they're forcibly brought here, that doesn't mean that they forget, and it doesn't mean that they willingly abandon it. They're they're forced to comply with the condition that they're in, but that doesn't mean that they don't have an awareness of the way that they were living before they were enslaved. And it does not say that they did not impart this understanding to their children or to the younger people. And people might compare the structures of one community to another. So there is the election of the Pinkster King, which is a reflection of the leadership. But then there's also subsequent and subordinate leadership structure that I don't know how much of that has necessarily be talked about, but it's necessary for us to consider what those possibilities are because they did exist.
Right, and it is that type of structure that actually facilitated these festivals. These things did just not happen, right? And white people did not organize it for their enslaved. They organized it for themselves. So there is that understanding and of societies that existed in, fraternal societies that existed in Africa. Those get transferred here. Women's societies, those get transferred here. Those things did not go away. And they roll into creating Black culture. As we come out of enslavement, it is those things of African culture and African structure that is the period of transition into what we have as Black culture today. Without those African foundations, we'd be like willy-nilly people. And that was not the case.
Exactly. And rites of passage. I mean, people recognize rites of passage. You have the rites of passage of birth. You have the rites of passage of puberty. You have the rites of passage of marriage. You have the rites of passage of childbearing. You have the rites of passage of death. And people were aware of these things and they recognized these things and they honored these things. And again, they were not included in the greater society. So they were charged with making sure that these things were taken care of within their community. And these things were done. And they were based on, rooted in, and emanated from those structures that had been existing in Africa for thousands of years.
It's so impactful to hear this spoken about in this way, because I think that often when we think about resistance, we think about it in the really outward ways like escape or revolt. And I don't think necessarily think we think about celebration or community or holding on to your cultural traditions as an act of resistance. So it's really interesting to hear it spoken about in that way.
But it is also an act of self-care, right? Because we don't have a lot of documentation about a bunch of crazy Africans running around New York. So how does one maintain mental health? One must have culture. One must have links to something. Even when one is isolated alone, how does one do that? Those things are important.
Absolutely. How have you all seen the celebration of Pinkster evolve over time, since its earliest recorded instance to modern day?
Well, it was a big break. There was a very big break because I think it's important. I think it's important for us to recognize the fact that the first Africans arrived here in a condition of enslavement, what, 1625?
No,
Was,
1627, August 29th,
okay,
1627. We now know that.
1627.
That's new.
Okay, so we have 1627, and the Pinkster Festival was outlawed in 1811. The first
Only in Albany.
No, okay, but so what we have is, and then King Charlie died about 1825, I believe. It was documented. So now we have evidences of Pinkster festivals taking place in the Hudson River Valley somewhere from about 1640 to 1840, because even though it was outlawed by the Albany Common Council in 1811, there are still documentations of Pinkster festivals taking place.
Yeah, so
Sojourner Truth would
right.
return to Aesopus because she remembered the Pinkster festivals. So, but it's important to think about this, that the Pinkster celebration spanned the Dutch colonial period to the British colonial period to the early American independent period. African people were celebrating their traditions throughout this period. It wasn't something, people talk about New Orleans and Congo Square, all due respect, but Africans celebrating their heritage in the Hudson River Valley dwarfs what Africans were doing in Congo Square in New Orleans.
And it but was because of the New Nation period that so it was banned in Albany, and now the question is, did they ban it because they wanted the land for the capital? And so, but it is suppressed during the New Nation period because of the growing awareness of things like election days, 4th of July, the independence celebration, other federal American things were coming in at a time when enslavement in New York has ended, right? The legal law of enslavement ends in 1827. And yes, in 2027, we will be celebrating or commemorating the 200th anniversary of the legal end of slavery. But during that time of transition, during that New Nation period, you also have a Black culture that is in heavy flux. So as Pinkster is banned in Albany, being suppressed by federal holidays that are new, that did not exist, this whole sense of being an American did not exist until we get to that period. And then you also have a Black culture in New York that is in flux because the law of slavery ends, but we have a lot of people still held in bondage because they were reclassified as indentured servants. And then you also had at this time the wave of the Southern slaves coming through New York to either hide here or to try to get to Canada. So by the time we get to the 1840s, there's a huge shift in culture. And because, whites did not want Blacks gathering in the thousands or in the hundreds, no, we can't have that, right? So all of that is suppressed. And then it is lost to cultural memory. A lot of New York history, right now, we have been in a huge process, as you know, of the last 20 years trying to get New York's individual history out from under Southern history. And that overlay of Southern history starts with the Underground Railroad period as we go into the Civil War. And then it is capped off when we go through the Great Migration. Our individual state story, our individual region story is pushed down by the American education system that puts all of enslavement connected to plantations in the South. And they pick up New York more often than not as a Underground Railroad place.
Yeah.
And Harriet Tubman is killing New York history, right? Love her, but it's hard because it's hard when so many of us have gone to school and learned that there was, no, New York was a safe place. Canada was a safe place. And you lose that period of enslavement, even in Canada. Canada wasn't free until like 1832, right? So all of that is a Pinkster now, as it has evolved back into conscious culture, it was maintained from the European standpoint. Within the Dutch culture in our region, they're maintained Pinkster from a European standpoint. But it's been 45 years, almost 50 years when it has started coming back through the African. And that process actually started at Phillipsburg Manor, Upper Mills, a property owned by Historic Hudson Valley. They switched it from the European concept to the African concept. And from there now, it is about re-educating everyone about New York's unique story, New York's unique Black history story. And Pinkster is a vital part of that.
Yeah, well, they were actually pushed to do that, Lavada, because
It doesn't matter. They did it. Nobody else
the
was.
African American Advisory Board,
Yes.
did it, and so that was during a period of time when there was an elevated desire and awareness in the Black community in particular, but in the United States, about exploring African history and African culture. So when Phillipsburg Manor engaged that,
A huge reinterpretation that they did about that site.
absolutely, and they had many of the pioneers. So when we talk about that break that took place, when it was outlawed, and then it waned for that period of time. In the 1970s, when the activity around it, there were people who were specialists in African culture and African heritage and African spirituality. People like Chief Bey, people like Pearl Primus, who were pioneers and icons of the practice of African culture here in the United States, who were involved in that resurgence. And that was the rock, that was the pebble in the pool that the ripples have spread, and they're still spreading to this day.
This is all just so much of this information. I know we are only going to be able to scratch the surface of all of this tonight because there's just so much to share. I have one more question because it's crazy because it's gone by so fast, but we're heading towards the end where we'll take questions from our audience if you all have them. But I would just love for you guys to share your thoughts on why it's important that we continue to celebrate Pinkster.
Because it is honoring the full humanity of the enslaved. Their presence is everywhere. You cannot go anywhere in New York, nowhere, and not be where they have been. New York was the second, New York held more enslaved people than any northern colony. And they're just not on the farms. They're in the urban spaces. They are everywhere. And to honor our ancestors, to see their full humanity and see the gift they gave us of creating Black culture is vital to our own individual healing and our healing as a culture and our healing as a world. They did not live in pain all the time. And we have continued, when we choose to only see them connected to the whipping post or in the bottom of a boat, we continue to dehumanize them. We have to allow them the full range of joy and emotion of humanness that they allowed themselves. So it is important to remember that, particularly in times as we struggle with racial issues, even to this day. That is important. They gifted us so much. And joy and happiness was a very, very part of that. The want to see a friend, the want to be laughing. It's a novel, but one of the things that I love about Satan's Toe by Fenimore Cooper, he talks about the laughter. They're always laughing. Well, you laugh when you see a friend you haven't seen in a year and they are still around. You laugh for the sheer mirth of laughing because somebody tells a joke. Your sense of humor does not just go away because you are an enslaved person. You laugh when you play a game with a child. You laugh when you dance. And we have to remember they did that. So why do we continue to deny that? By only seeing their pain, by only seeing the brutality. They had pride in their work. They were master craftsmen in everything they did because they had no choice. So this is why I celebrate. And this is why I think it's vital that we as a culture and a state celebrate, is to own that and embrace the richness that is the history here in New York that speaks to amazing, truly amazing people.
For me, everything that Lavada said, but also, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a resident, a resident and a citizen of New York State. Okay, people who are conscious will go into the grocery store and they'll pick products off the shelf and they'll read the labels because they want to know what's in what they're about to eat. But they want to ignore what is in what makes us American. The impact and the influences of Africans in this country throughout its history are indelible. So why are we going to dismiss it? Why are we going to ignore it? Why are we going to deny it? You know, I don't see any difference between different communities. Different communities. We celebrate Columbus Day. We celebrate Chinese New Year. We celebrate all of these different celebrations about the heritage of the residents of this country. We're in Passover now. We have all of these different celebrations, but because of the dynamics of what happened with enslavement, Africa gets painted with a broad brush, and it's something that nobody wants to recognize, nobody wants to look at, nobody wants to consider, nobody wants to unpack. But we just talked about royalty. We just talked about music. We just talked about so many things. And as Lavada said, the experts that were here that were brought, they were royalty. They were traders. They were tanners. They were architects. They were navigators. They were blacksmiths. And they were agriculturalists. We can go on and on and on and on and on. And as we delve into this history, we recognize the impact of what the skills and the deep knowledge that these people brought to America that is now considered to be American. But it originated with Africans. But we don't want to consider that because it makes us give a really hard look at Africa, and it makes us consider who were these people and what were they subjected to? And this is a conversation that this country is really not ready to have yet. But nothing is going to move forward until this conversation is had. The facts are there. The documentation is there. Anybody that wants to pick up a book can read it for themselves. But, you know, for various reasons, different people want to shy away from this conversation and this knowledge, but it's there and it's begging to emerge so that we can be a more healthy society, so we can be healthier individuals, which makes for a healthy society, which makes for a healthy country, which makes for a healthy world. People say, oh my God, what's going on? What's going on is that maybe we're not dealing with things truthfully. We're not dealing with things honestly. We're not dealing with things completely. So with the Pinkster Festival, to bring it around, it's an opportunity for us to have the opportunity to experience a little bit of it, not in a book, not in a documentary, but actually to immerse ourselves in what does it feel like. You know, we've been involved in doing these Pinkster reenactments for decades now. And the opportunity for a moment to explore what happened, who were the people, what did they do, what impact did they have? All of that is, it goes to healing. It goes to resolving. It goes to clarifying who we are in 2024 in New York State, in the United States.
And it goes to having fun.
Absolutely.
You gotta have some fun, as they had to have fun, right?
Lavada, Chief Avanil, I'm so moved by everything that you've shared tonight. Thank you so much. I want to open it up to our guests to see if they have any questions or comments for the two of you. You're free to unmute, or you can even put your statement into the chat.
Well, while we're waiting, I wanted to make a public service announcement. In 2027, New York will experience two of the most important Black history anniversaries. On July 4th and 5th, we will commemorate the 200th anniversary of the ending of legal enslavement in New York, but not the freeing of all of the people. Because of a paper written and published last summer by Dr. Jaap Jacobs, we now know 8 weeks later, on August the 29th, we will commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first 22 men purchased and enslaved by the Dutch West India Company in New Netherlands. 1 year, we will have huge waves. This is an opportunity to study, learn, and get ready. On July the 5th at 12 noon, we're asking everyone to ring a bell for 1 minute to acknowledge that there was slavery in New York. Take this time to enjoy Pinkster, to study Black history. We are researching all over the state, and we know so much more. Right now, at the New York Historical Society, there is a piece called an impungu that was taken out of a house, a Dutch house in Lower Manhattan. It is on display for the first time. For its entire life, it has been part of the New York State Museum's collection, misidentified as an Nkisi. Now, with Black scholarship help, it is on display in an amazing exhibit of New York before New York, all about the Costello Plan. That piece is there. The letter that Peter Minuet wrote to the Dutch West India Company saying that he'd purchased Manhattan is on display. It is a powerful exhibit, small, but very, very powerful. So I do encourage everyone to go down there if you can, come to Pinkster and celebrate, but also get ready for 2027.
Thank you so much, Lavada, and absolutely 100%. I just want to give one last opening to anyone who might have a question. Oh, there's someone has asked a question. Can any aspects of Pinkster celebrations be attributed to a specific African culture? For example, can any dances or rituals be described as specifically Congolese or from Madagascar, etc.?
Most of the documentation is supporting that the base of most things are Congolese. And remember that the descriptions that we have of the dances and how things were done are coming by whites. So even if we don't understand what they're saying, we don't have enough information to differentiate those coming out of the upper part of West Africa or out of Madagascar. The majority of the enslaved that we have here in New York are in fact from Congo and Angola, as most of the people enslaved throughout the 12 years of the transatlantic slave trade. So of that time period, not the 12 years, but the 12 million people transported, 12 to 50 million people transported out of Africa, the majority of those people come from Angola, and Congo is next for the entire timeline.
Nick said thank you.
Also, it's a matter that, it's really difficult because of the documentation and who was doing the documentation. It's difficult to identify specifics because they were not documented accurately. Most of the time, they were done in a very surreptitious way. It was very shallow, and even the drumming would be considered noise. It wasn't even considered music. It was not until the 1960s that African drum music in this country was considered worthy of being listened to. So in terms of except for generalities, you know, where you might have a circle dancing and reflective of the Dikanga or the focus on the 4 moments of the sun or a particular type of drum. There are regional types of drum that we may be able to identify from some of the documentation. That's some of the work that I'm involved in, trying to identify or trying to recreate some of the drums that were described so that we can have a look at it and see what it relates to. But beyond that, there was not, first of all, a knowledge of the traditions. Second of all, there was not a respect of the traditions, so much so that we could depend on the documentation to be accurate enough at this stage to be able to identify with any definite specificity of what it was.
A lot of the documentation is actually newspaper stories. It shows up in letters though, when people say they're, you know, going to Pinkster or doing something, or it shows up in a novel. But a lot of what we have are actually newspaper reports.
Thank you guys so much, and thanks for your question, Nick. We're actually are really, really close to our time. So I want to thank everyone for attending Pinkster's Legacy tonight. A special, special thank you to Chief Baba Neal and Lavada. Your commitment to continuing the legacy of Pinkster and also just the legacy of those with African descent in New York is inspirational and admirable. And we just really, really appreciate you and your expertise tonight. I want to take a moment. I mentioned the Pinkster Festival at the beginning of the presentation, but now that you have a little bit more information about it, I hope that you all will join us for Pinkster Day on Saturday, May 4th from 12 to 4. It is an opportunity for us to give humanity to this culture and to just celebrate. There's going to be tours, music, theater, and there's also going to be some incredible food from a vendor called Voila Afrique. So I really hope that we'll all see you there. Thank you again so much and have a fantastic night, everyone. Goodbye.
All right.